Today is the first of two episodes we'll be doing related to biology and life sciences. And yeah, that's coming off the heels of the genealogy episode I did with my friend Andre during Black History Month. The next one will be in a few months, and since I think the surprise is part of the fun, I won't share any more on that. However, that brings us to this month. 2 months ago, we were hosting a game party at my house, and on her way out the door, I asked my friend Bridget what type of doctor she was. Now, honestly, I've been looking for a neurodoc for a while now, and when she said it, I think I closed the door and cornered her for a few minutes explaining the podcast and asking her if she'd do it. I don't think it's a spoiler to say, here she is. Honestly, I try and bring people from a range of interesting fields to the show, and I hope you're enjoying it and sharing episodes with your friends. Feedback and suggestions of guests are always welcome, but for now, enjoy this conversation with my friend Bridget. I want to welcome my friend and neighbor, Bridget, to the podcast. Bridget, welcome. Can you take a moment and introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. I'm happy to be here, of course. I'm Bridget Arnett. I'm a board certified neurologist. I specialize in sleep medicine and neuromuscular medicine, specifically clinical neurophysiology is my major training. So initially, though, I'm a neuroscientist first with a PhD in neurobiology, and I've used that practice and scientific training to define how I approach my medical practice and taking care of patients. So that's a quick backdrop, but I always have to remind myself that first and foremost, before any degrees, I was married. So, and I've been a wife of 40, a little more than 40 years. Every time I say that, it sounds amazing. I'm a mother of three and now a grandmother of two, a 32-month-old, almost 3-year-old, and a 4-month-old. So that's what defines me today more than anything, because that takes up all of my extra time. Other things that are important where you just can't work, you just can't think of family, there are hobbies. So other things that just are wonderful to me that bring me joy beyond my grandchildren would be my joy of music and playing the piano as much as I can, bringing out my saxophone as much as I can. I'd say those are the things that define me, that bring me peace, that keep me up and ready to be up and ready to move forward for the day.
Bridget, I want to get into how we know each other, but before we do that, can you describe what it is that you do today in your field? Because it's probably something most people aren't as familiar with as they will be by the time we're done talking today.
Yes. So as a neurologist, I take care of the nervous system, the brain, spinal cord, nerves, and muscles. And in doing that, some well-known diseases such as Alzheimer's, dementia, migraines, Parkinson disease, neuropathies, pinched nerves from the back like sciatica, those are disorders that a neurologist would frequently evaluate and take care of. So my fellowship training is in clinical neurophysiology, and because of that, I am one of the first people who will see a beyond the primary care doctor, a patient who has some of those complaints. Like I said, I'm trained to find muscle and nerve problems, and that's what clinical neurophysiology is, but also other brain problems, such as using EEGs and performing electrical evaluations of the brain and the nervous system. So that's what my major training is in. That's what clinical neurophysiology is. So I see a lot of those patients with epilepsy or problems with electrical conduction of the brain, problems with electrical conduction or misalignment of the neuromuscular system or the nervous system, causing neuropathies or pinched nerves in the back or neck or carpal tunnel syndrome. So those may be terms that people are more familiar with to get a better understanding of what a neurologist, what I would do specifically.
Got it. Thanks for breaking that down before we get into this. Now, Bridget, how would you say that we know each other? Because we've known each other for a long time, and we had some fun trying to figure out exactly how it is that we actually met.
Yeah, now, I always have to default to my friend Natasha, and that's what I wanted to do, to say that's how I knew her through your wife, but that is not true. the more I thought about it, we met at church. For whatever reason, you and my husband just love to say hi to one another at church. And I think we sat right in front of one another, I think, at that early service, right?
Right, and
Or
as
next.
Rev would say, we sort of sat in the same zip code, usually pretty close to each other. And back in the day, during the welcome of visitors, there would be like a good 5 minute detour where you just sort of walk around and catch up with people. And I'm sure that's sort of where we got to be friendly with each other.
Yes, yes. And so then we became church friends, but never really saw one another outside of church until one fateful day. You saw my husband walking from one house to the other, and then you guys stopped and realized that we were neighbors. And we had not yet moved into the house that we were rehabbing and still living in our former house, which was like 5 blocks from where you live now.
Yeah, we bought a house in between your two houses, and out of context, it was so weird seeing Mark walking down the street. I was like, I know that guy really well, and I have no idea why. And then I think I just sort of stopped him when we started talking and realized you were literally going to move half a block away. And
Right.
I think from there, when you finally moved in, you hosted a game night or two, and the rest is history.
Yes, yes, yes. But it's just so funny to remember how that all evolved.
Bridget, I want to talk about your path finding a home to treating neuromuscular issues and improving people's neuromuscular health. How did you find yourself into that field? Was this something that you wanted to do, when you were a young girl at home watching TV at 5 years old and you said that's what I want to do, or was it a different path?
Yeah, it was definitely a different path. I remember distinctly being that young person, seventh grade maybe, or eighth grade, thinking, wow, I want to be a investigative journalist, or I really wanted to be a reporter, but my thought was I would investigate certain stories
Hmm.
and present them, and I would actually be sort of like a broadcast journalist. That's how I kind of pictured myself. And my parents pretty much said, that's not going to happen. You're that's not in the cards. So my parents were very STEM oriented, let's put it that way. My
Hmm.
dad being in architecture, my mom being a math teacher, and being really geared toward science as well. To them, you had to go into STEM or medicine or something to be a viable citizen.
Yeah, it's funny because we talk about how we know each other, and it took me many, many years after I think I had even been to your game night to realize that I knew your dad before I really knew you and Mark, because we took
Mm.
the men's only Bible study class together for a very long time. It was very clear to me that he valued academics and learning. So hearing you describe what you just described makes total sense to me in retrospect. But what did that look like for you when school came around?
So my parents were school teachers, Chicago public school teachers, but would not let us go to a Chicago public school. So I started off in a Catholic elementary school in my neighborhood in Morgan Park. You had to do very well in school, which I did, and that was important to them, and it was important enough to me to do well, of course, to please my parents. And I remember one of the big highlights that was important. This was in 1978, 1977, 1978. I think the Chicago public schools were just thinking about their magnet schools and
Hmm.
getting magnet schools together and trying to understand, can young Chicago students really handle a curriculum that's maybe 2 grades greater than their age or something like
Hmm.
that. So
Hmm.
I was actually chosen in seventh grade, no, in eighth grade, to go to Morgan Park High School to take algebra. Kind of always loved math, always loved science, but that was sort of the first time that I realized, because I was chosen, I got to walk to, a high school
Hmm.
and be an grader in high school and take algebra and get high school credit for it too. That's sort of the first time that I realized, hey, I'm pretty good at math. I kind of there may be something to this.
And when you get to high school, does it just continue on that trajectory? Do you stay ahead of the curve? If you were taking algebra in eighth grade, you definitely started ahead of most freshmen.
Yes, well, like I told you, you know my dad. So yes, when I got to high school, that was another parochial school, a Lutheran school, and so I started off as a freshman taking geometry. Every summer, we couldn't be idle at home. My dad would make us read a book a week, and we had to write a report on that book. And he read the report, he graded it, graded our grammar, the thesis statement, you name it. It was, yeah, yeah, this is what we did. We also had to go to summer school, and Mindle was a Catholic all boys high school where you could take summer classes, and my high school accepted those credits. So the summer between my freshman and sophomore years, I took trigonometry and I think either a Spanish class or French class or something like that. And so when I returned to high school for my sophomore year, I was now taking pretty much calculus. And I was in the calculus class, believe it or not, with my brother, who was 2 years older than me, a senior. So I was the sophomore in the calculus class. Everyone else was a senior, and I was a sophomore. So that kind of set the trajectory there.
Oh my goodness. Now, you're excelling in your STEM classes, but this went beyond getting good grades and pleasing your dad. What really sparked the interest for you in the science part of STEM? Because that didn't have to happen. Was there something you look back on and say, that was one of the trajectory turning points?
Oh, yes, yes. I was always interested in science and just really kind of fell in love with the science that we were kind of forced to, fulfill all the criteria for college prep, so to speak. And so I took the usual chemistry and biology, but I think it was my junior year, there was a biochem class that was being taught by a professor from the University of Chicago. She left her tenured track position or whatever position she had at University of Chicago because her son was cognitively disabled. So she wanted to take care of him. She was a biochem instructor from the University of Chicago and taught at our school, but she was so enthusiastic and clearly could break down the science so well that I just fell in love with biochemistry. At that moment, I said I was going to be a biochemist. She was sort of like, I guess, my mentor. I looked up to her so much. She was a biochemist, and that's exactly what I wanted to be. So I think it's even in my yearbook. Like, what do you want to do? And I've actually written, I'm going to be a biochemist. So
The good news is you ended up going to Northwestern, and I assume you started with biochem as a major, but that's not what you graduated in, is it?
correct. I started off with biochem, and during my junior year at NU, I took a class called Biological Clocks. I believe that was the name of the class. The professor was Fred Turek, and he was at that time really involved in sort of the early research on circadian rhythms and biological clocks. So he taught this class and was so good at teaching the science of neurobiology and neuroscience that I then said, I'm going to be a neurobiologist. I foolishly changed my major as a junior from biochem
Oh my
to
gosh.
neurobiology. Had to take probably 5 extra classes in neuroscience that to fulfill that major. Pretty much everything else I had probably done with physics and chemistry and
Hmm.
organic chemistry, you name it. But I had to take all these extra classes just to graduate with a degree the degree was neurobiology and physiology was the name of the major.
So we're
And
kind of on the track to where we are today, but you ended up going to grad school. And what did you do in grad school? Is this where neuromuscular systems starts to come into play?
yes, well, I worked on invertebrate neurobiology and I mapped out what's called a central pattern generator or the of eating and then regurgitation. So this pathway in this snail, I was able to map out this neuromuscular system if you think about it because I'm looking at the actual physical muscular behavior at the same time I'm recording from actual nerve cells and looking at the simultaneous behavior and electrical activity at the same time. So that was pretty much my thesis, the central pattern generation of feeding and regurgitation in the snail helosoma. I believe that is the title of my.
Oh my goodness. But Bridget, you see people today. So how did you pivot from snails to people? Like
Yeah,
how does that happen? Because you ended up getting a PhD, not an MD.
correct. So I guess maybe I got tired of snails. No. But there are a lot of, I guess, African American women in neuroscience and in doctoral programs. In 1988, when I started, that was, it was a hard pathway. You weren't always welcome. And there were incentives and grant programs to incentivize women in STEM, especially neuroscience. There was Illinois Minority Graduate Incentive Program, MGIP, I think is what it was called,
Hmm.
that I was actually awarded that grant maybe my second year or third year into my doctoral program. But there were a lot of people who did not look like me in the program who were not happy that I was in that program. So they made it hard, made it harder than it should have been. I found other mentors outside of U of I, specifically a mentor at WashU who was also a neurologist and neuroscientist and had an MD PhD. And he kind of showed me that there were ways to be scientific, take care of humans, and still use your brain and knowledge and use the scientific method, but you're caring for human beings. So I shadowed him for a couple of weeks off and on, and then realized that, hey, I actually like this idea of
Hmm.
neurology and sort of segueing from being a neuroscientist to neurology. So in the middle of my doctoral program, when I was just about finished with my thesis, pretty much I just had to write up my thesis. I,
Hmm.
I had completed almost all of the bench science that had to be done. I went to med school. So I think I put my PhD on hold for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years, and completed 2 years of med school. And then I was able to go back and defend my thesis and graduate. While I was in my first 2 years of med school, in the evenings, I would go back and do a little, like maybe once or twice a week, I'd go back for 4 or 5 hours in the evenings and do research in the lab with my team. But I think because of some of the political pressures, some of the difficulty being an African American woman in neurobiology at that time, it just seemed so daunting. In a way, I just felt, am I always going to be trying to prove myself, trying to prove that I belong here, that I'm smart enough? Do I have to fight for tenure for the rest of my life? And it seemed a lot easier to go into medicine because then it's a lot easier to kind of prove yourself as an MD than to convince people that you're worthwhile as a PhD. At least that's how I saw it at that time.
Yeah, and when you show up at conferences and stuff like that back then, I imagine you weren't what they were expecting.
Oh my goodness, no. I mean, my name did not quite fit with the expected image. And, this predated social media and Facebook. So you couldn't just look up what someone looked like right away unless my picture was in the Society for Neuroscience pamphlet or index of presenters. And usually your pictures weren't, it was just your name.
Right.
And when you showed up to give a talk or to present your poster, people got to see you for the first time. And if it a lot of times it wasn't what someone expected. So I would get, questions about who I was, not what I could do, like how I got there, and not what I'm presenting to you. You're clearly interested in my science and what I've presented. So why pivot from the topic to ask questions about me? It happened enough times. I had a lot of supporters too.
Hmm.
There were a lot of people who would just, tamp down the noise, so to speak, and then ask me specific questions about my research and how, it helped them with their research and, things like that. But I just realized that my appearance was just making it too hard for others. And in some ways, like I said, if I had the maturity then that I have now, I would have stayed right where I was. I wouldn't have gone into medicine.
Hmm.
I would have been really, I'm so much more confident and forceful and proud now. And then I wasn't meek, but I didn't want to stand out in that way. I didn't want people to question me, not realizing that it was really their problem and not mine. I realize that now, but at that time, you're 23, you're 24, you're in grad school right out of undergrad. What do you know, right?
Knowing a little about your family and especially your dad, being a high achiever academically isn't a big leap. Picking up a medical degree while doing your PhD, I guess, in nights and weekends part time isn't entirely surprising given your background. But when I talk to you about what you do, it's more than just that. And I have to ask, when did it become home for you? Like, when did you realize like that pivot that you made relatively late in your academic journey was the right pivot for you?
I think I realized once I started med school, it was a pivot. It was very different from bench research, of course. And then I realized that I could actually apply a lot of knowledge to a human being and work within their system, almost like a research project, figure out, what their problem is, hypothesize what the issues are, and then with all the data sets that you've acquired, which is their history and or a test that you perform, you can come up with a plan of treatment. And by the time, with med school, once you are in your third year of med school, you're in the hospitals. And I really just fell in love with medicine and knew that I was going to be a neurologist. I think from the
Mm-hmm.
beginning, I knew I was going into neurology and realized that I loved talking to people, helping them, figuring out what their problem was, and coming up with solutions. Even as a medical student, I realized that I kind of had a knack for it
Mm-hmm.
and started to get really excited about being a physician.
When you did your residency and you started to see patients, was it really that quick? I mean, because there's a piece of you that had been training sort of in a lab with your snails, and now you're actually, I guess, in a hospital or a doctor's office with patients and other residents and all the chaos that comes with being in a hospital. It's not peaceful. It's a very different vibe, isn't it?
It is, it is. And that does start your third year of med school. And things really do change, though, once you're an intern, because there's more autonomy. You're still being trained, of course, but you have to prove that you actually learned something in med school by that time.
Right.
Definitely once I started my residency for just neurology in general, I trained at Rush in neurology for residency and fellowship. And they had a really, really rigorous program. The teachers at that time felt that it was so important to get the history from the patient so that you had to be very personable and you had to know how to socially work with your patients. They were so driven in data acquisition, finding out what's going on with the patient, understanding all of the points that lead to a certain syndrome and therefore diagnosis. And they were so interested in you obtaining that data before you even order a test.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was figure out what the diagnoses could be and then figure out what test to order, and you better justify it. So the training that I got actually made it really much more exciting to be a neurologist because of how we were taught. And I know that it's a special place and it was a special team that I trained with at that time, but I think I fell in love with medicine. I loved neurology, still love neurology, but saw all the possibilities of where my specialty could take me and how I could help patients and really make this profession my home. Be happy to wake up every morning to be a neurologist and work with patients.
Bridget, I want to get into a few of the things that make working to address neuromuscular issues and maximize neuromuscular health home for you. Like most healthcare professionals, I feel like it's a ministry for you, not just a job. So, where should we start?
Yes, so I do think of my profession as a calling because I've gotten to that point where I'm not part of the hustle and bustle so much of trying to make a buck like you do when you're first starting out and you
Right.
and everyone wants to be paid for their services, of course, but I also have branched out to consider using my expertise above and beyond just neurology and above and beyond medicine. It's important to me to address neuromuscular issues. It's important to me to problem solve. I love this idea that someone presents with a set of problems. They don't know what's wrong with them. I have to ask just the right questions, almost like a research project. Ask all the right questions, get them to give me the answers so
Hmm.
that we can figure out together exactly what's going on with them. And it's gratifying to know that you can glean as much information from a patient because you took the time to be personable, get them to feel comfortable, to even think of other things that bother them that they may have thought wasn't germane to their original presentation or what was concerning. And if I know that I can make them feel comfortable enough to divulge everything that's bothering them, we wind up helping that whole person above and beyond sometimes just their neurological condition or their neuromuscular condition, but we help them in general.
And you mean because, yeah, I might come in with double vision or weakness on one side, but I might have something else, and you realize like, oh, there's a common root cause there. And is that what you're talking about here? You can make connections that people wouldn't make on their own.
Sometimes you'd be amazed that sometimes the patients are sent because of one single problem, and it's written in their referral from their doctor. The patient has this, and this. Okay, we address it. But the patient also feels comfortable enough having a conversation that we're solving their problems and someone's taking the time to solve their problems. They'll then, believe it or not, this happened a couple of weeks ago. I can't even make this up. I'm not joking. A patient will then divulge a problem that they never even told their primary doctor before, but they feel so comfortable that they want to tell you that they're having a problem because they're hoping that you'll address it. And just a quick aside, there was a patient who presented to me for one problem and then toward the end of our session said, and by the way, for about 20 years, I've had this pain, numbness, and tingling in my hands. I actually, about 2 weeks later, did her EMG, which is a nerve conduction study, and discovered she has severe carpal tunnel syndrome. And I
Oh,
said, ma'am, did you not? This has been going on for so long. Oh, it just became part of me. I never thought of it until you started talking to me about paying attention to your body. And I said, well, I wasn't thinking about that.
oh my
So I tell
goodness.
you, I cannot make this up. She has severe carpal. She needs to see a surgeon. That's how severe it is. And she never told her primary care doctor.
Bridget, as you're asking all these questions, I imagine you're learning a lot about your field in addition to different ways that different medical conditions show up. But is this continuous learning something special for you? Because I know when we were preparing for this, you were talking about some of the things that you're learning, and I'm like, you're decades into it at this point. Are you still learning every day?
I am still learning every day. One of the good things, I am not so old that I don't have to do something called continuing medical education or CME. Some doctors, maybe 5 years ahead of me, they don't have to do the educational programs that I have to. Because of my board certifications, you still have to recertify and you still have to keep up with learning and reading papers and things like that, which I kind of love the fact that I'm forced to do it in some ways and keep and be held to a deadline. But I think I would do it anyway because it's important to stay abreast of the latest developments within your field and learning new ways to approach situations. So that is important to me. But I'm learning more every day because of how patients present themselves and how they present typical problems, but in novel ways, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just interesting as the world evolves. The diseases are still the same, but they present differently. So, yes, I am still learning. You still use your same medical acumen that you've learned to understand how a patient presents when I'm using my EMG machine or when I'm reviewing EEGs or what we call evoked potentials, you realize that you can use these instruments, you can learn how to use them in different and novel ways beyond what you were just taught. Before I kind of likened it to a jazz musician using some improvisation. You're using that same instrument, but you are tweaking your tools to maximize their function to help the patients.
Now, I know that some of the tools have continued to improve as science has continued to improve, but there's still, at least from the outside, a lot of mysteries with people's brains and the nervous systems and things like that. How do you incorporate that mystery or that lack of knowledge from the scientific community into your practice as you're working with patients and trying to solve, novel issues and new issues?
Luckily, there has been research beyond me, and there are always algorithms and evidence based approaches to very specific diseases and syndromes. The thing that I've done above and beyond just being a researcher, being a scientist, being a neurologist is taking certain principles that I've learned and understood after just seeing decades of patients and learning how to consider a preventive path.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, I've used my medical knowledge to present different ways of treating patients beyond medicine. For instance, working with patients to build up their balance skills, to exercise, to do cognitive exercises,
Mm-hmm.
play games. I've gotten to the point where it's not just medicine delivery per se, but treating that patient and offering them other ways to be more fit from a neuronal, neuromuscular, and cognitive point of view.
You mentioned relationships you have with your patients and how the people interactions, which candidly sounds like it was more interesting than working with snails, were important to you. But can you share a little bit more about what's special there? Unlike the times I've gone to a doctor with like a broken bone, they set my bone, a couple weeks later they take the cast off, and I kind of never really see them again. But I don't feel like the work that you're doing is that type of thing that people so easily forget. Given some of the conditions and treatments that you're offering up for people, it really feels like it changes their quality of life in some ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. When you are seeing a patient with a chronic disorder, then you are, especially if you've diagnosed them with that chronic disorder, you are holding their hand and guiding them through the initial phase, the treatment, the chronic component of that disorder, and all of the ravages of that chronic disorder. And so you're there with that patient, holding their hand, guiding them, and you're there for the long haul. So there are patients that I've had and cared for at least 20 years, and you get to know their children,
Mm-hmm.
their grandchildren when they're born, and they become special and really part of your family. You develop that relationship with that patient, but at the same time, it informs your approach to every patient, even if it is a patient that you see maybe 3 times, you solve their problem, you never see them again, but you still treat them like they're a family of a 20-year relationship like any
Mm-hmm.
other patient.
Mm-hmm.
Because I try to take that approach as I've become an older physician, I've learned how important that is. The more I've practiced, I probably didn't understand that as much when I first started out, just out of fellowship, but definitely in the last 15 plus years, I've understood how important it is to have that type of approach and relationship. And it's always surprising as a physician, you don't always think that your approach is meaningful to patients. My idea is that I am helping you. My approach is to diagnose you, fix the problem, hopefully, or put it in remission.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's just surprising. I've had patients come back to my office 4 years later, 3 years later. One woman recently, it was almost 6 years later, to tell my staff that I changed her life because I was kind and took time and actually she still carried a piece of paper in her wallet where I gave her several steps that she should do every day to help work on a particular problem that she had. And she said initially she thought that it was, this is, you know, she's really reaching here. But my staff told me that she pulled this paper out of her wallet and they said, that's Dr. Arnett's handwriting. And she carried it in her wallet and she performed these exercises and she did these things that I asked her to do. And I had not seen this lady for almost 5 years because I switched offices, and I'd actually seen her at the previous office, and
Mm.
she had not been at our new office, and we'd been there for maybe 4 years, so she was not on the books as being seen in our office. So it was at least 4 or 5 years that I hadn't seen her. And when they told me the story, they described her, I remembered exactly who they were talking about. I don't remember writing all that down, but I do write down bullet points for patients and guidance on papers. And it's just really funny that you would never think that you could touch a patient that way, because if patients, just like when we go to restaurants and leave reviews, we leave the reviews if we don't like them. We don't always leave a review when we like someone. So it's just amazing that as physicians, we don't always hear when people like us, but it's more often than not that people want to give us 5 stars, but they should not rate. I feel you should not rate a doctor, honestly. You should have a conversation with them if you didn't like what they did. But it's just amazing to think that you touched someone, it changed them, they actually believed in what you said, even if you have not seen them for several years. So that really blows my mind. And when that, it doesn't happen often that you get that type of feedback from patients, but it just reminds you to be so human, so kind, and very specific with every patient, not with the thought that, because we're never thinking that we're going to get a rating or something, but the idea that you're going to actually help somebody. Oh, it makes you want to work that much harder every day.
Bridget, it sounds like your journey has included parts of being a researcher, being a scientist, and also a little bit being a patient advocate and a friend and an advisor to your patients. Does your work today still satisfy all of the different parts of your background? Are you bringing in all of the things that you've sought when you pursued this path?
No, that's a good question. There's probably one thing that I do miss, and that's bench research, to just sit down and have an organism, come up with a hypothesis, perform certain experiments. I mean, that in some ways I kind of miss, but if I think about it, I'm not using humans as organisms, but I'm still coming up with a hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
I can still write papers on interesting cases. I still actually see some corollaries with mammalian or non mammalian science and corollaries with humans, and come up with papers and ideas in that regard. So it's not the same as my classic bench research, which, like I said, I miss in some ways, but I still try to approach medicine and many of the tools that I use in a similar way.
Mm-hmm.
To think of it as not quite experimentation on human beings, I'm not trying to say that, but definitely using that scientific method as a way to understand what a patient is telling me, how that fits into the general medical knowledge, and then how I can extract treatment programs for that particular individualized patient. So in some ways, I think I still kind of take that research or scientific approach to the patient without actually experimenting on them.
Bridget, I want to thank you for making time to share today. And it's the end of a long workday at the start of the week. But I like bringing guests on that are doing things that are new to many people. Where can we go to learn more about the type of work that you do or the field itself?
So the type of work that I do, the best site would be my website for my business, hydeparkneurology.com. But to get a sense of the things that I love to do on the side, where I kind of take off my doctor hat and use more of my scientist hat for the whole approach, the full approach of the patient, where we perform a lot of community-based activities such as walk with a doc on Saturdays in Washington Park, our memory skills clinic that we do on Wednesday afternoons in Olympia Fields, and our balance skills program that's every Friday at 5:30. Right now it's a Zoom, but we're going to perform pop-ups. That information is at neurorehabcoach.com. So there are two websites, one strictly for the neurology side of things, and the other for the fun, physical, holistic healing component that I feel is just as important as the medicinal side.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining today. I really appreciate you coming on and having this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of My Home is Special. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes automatically. You can go to myhomeisspecial.com to see the full project and sign up for email updates. Be sure to follow KBevPhoto on Instagram or go to kbevphoto.com to see what I'm snapping these days. There's a lot on both to explore. For now, this is Keith, aka KBev, signing off. Peace.